On March 21st, 2017, Tony Hawk tweeted, TSA agent, checking my ID. Hawk, like that skateboarder, Tony Hawk. Me. Exactly. Her. Cool. I wonder what he's up to these days. Me. This is the Museum of Twitter, the show where we talk about the most important tweets in the history of Twitter.com. It's Subscriber Sunday, where my Patreon subscribers get to suggest and then vote on what I cover. And they suggested a classic tweet from the great skateboarder Tony Hawk. Actually, it's a classic example of a type of tweet from the skateboarder Tony Hawk. Because Tony Hawk has been recognized, or not recognized, or almost recognized many times in public. I'm going to go through examples on this episode, but trust me, there are more examples than I can go through. And I think it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I think the fact that he's so transparent about it is interesting in the context of fame, in the context of his level of fame. Because if we're to take this example in particular, it's very interesting because clearly Tony Hawk is famous enough to the person at TSA where she recognizes the name Tony Hawk and knows that he's a famous skateboarder. But she isn't so familiar with him that she is able to recognize him by his face. And I think there are multiple reasons for this. I think one is that Tony Hawk is a type of celebrity that people are familiar with by name, like he's a shorthand for a famous skateboarder, but if you're not into that world at all, you might not see him that often. And he's also someone who has aged somewhat since his prime of being in public life. Like, yes, I would recognize Tony Hawk if he looked like this and came up to me at TSA, but maybe someone who really only saw him from some clips in the 90s wouldn't. But I actually think the biggest reason is because in one's life, most people you see who look like a famous celebrity are not actually that famous celebrity. There's only one skateboarder named Tony Hawk in the world, but presumably there are other people whose name is Anthony Hawk. In the same way, there's only one person who is Tony Hawk in the world, but presumably there are a lot of people who look somewhat like Tony Hawk. So if you see someone and you're like, I think that might be Tony Hawk, the actual odds are it is not Tony Hawk. I actually think it's related to the whole concept of why people don't realize that Clark Kent is Superman. It's because in the world that Superman exists in, there is only one Superman, and presumably there are a lot of people who look somewhat like Superman. So if you see Clark Kent, who's your coworker, it is more likely that he looks like Superman than he is actually Superman. Now, in this specific example, I think that the TSA agent's being a little dumb because she is both seeing his name and seeing him. But once again, we don't know how much she knows about Tony Hawk. Maybe she just knows that the video game existed because her little brother played it back in the day. And let's look at some other examples of this phenomenon. For example, he said in 2019 that he was at a rental car agency. He couldn't find his name on the monitor. He went inside and waited, and he got to the front, and the agent sees him and says, "You really are Tony Hawk." Me. Yes, I was looking for my name outside on the list. Him. I deleted it because I thought it was fake. Now this, I think, is a somewhat rational and understandable reaction. I don't know if I would have deleted it, but I would have probably been like, I don't know, I think this is fake. No one's coming in here saying their name's Tony Hawk. Another time he was at TSA, a TSA agent said, "I'm trying to figure out who you look like before checking your ID." Me. Okay. TSA. That's cyclist Armstrong. Nearby agent. That ain't Lance Armstrong. Me. He's right. TSA. Oh, you look like that skateboarder. Same last name too. Crazy. Me. Crazy. I also think that this is also a good example because I think what it gets at is the fact that where people put celebrities in their brain is not in an organized fashion. I think it's why celebrities who don't really look that much alike get confused for each other so often. Like how Elijah Wood and Daniel Radcliffe get confused for each other. I don't think if they're standing right next to each other, anyone would ever confuse them. But I think that people put Elijah Wood's face and Daniel Radcliffe's face into the same box of like lead of a fantasy movie from back in the day. And because people don't have the same name recall that I do, they kind of get that jumbled up and they see one and it's like, oh, that's the Harry Potter guy. Because they're just rummaging around in a bin marked short guy who led a fantasy series. That's how someone confuses Tony Hawk and Lance Armstrong. I don't think that they actually think that Tony Hawk looks like Lance Armstrong. They just put Tony Hawk's face into like a extreme sports type bin. And when they're pulling out, they're like, is that Lance Armstrong? As for the end bit, this person's just as dumb as the initial TSA agent. I mean, he's right in front of you. His name's Tony Hawk. Come on. And this example in 2014 illustrates my point about people never assuming that they're meeting a celebrity. Because he said about a guy at a gas station in Iowa. This is in Iowa. They said, anyone ever tell you that you look like a young Tony Hawk? Now, Tony Hawk said that this person is his new favorite person, but I think that this person is being completely rational. They're in Iowa. Why would Tony Hawk randomly be at a gas station in Iowa? It's much more likely that you would meet someone who looks like a young Tony Hawk than you would meet an actual Tony Hawk. And this further bolsters the TSA person in the original tweet. The tweet says it's from Anchorage, Alaska. Why would Tony Hawk be at an airport in Anchorage, Alaska? In 2009, a girl at a restaurant said to him, "Are you Tony Hawk?" And he said yes, and she said why, and he had no idea how to answer that question. Now, this doesn't illustrate any point. I just think it's a funny tweet. Another example I think is just funny is that a flight attendant was checking overhead bins, saw 4 skateboards and said, is Tony Hawk on this flight or something? Then looked down, saw him and said, I guess he is. And because Tony Hawk tweeted about the phenomenon about getting recognized or not getting recognized so often, he did this tweet in 2018 where a guy at an airport yelled at him, "Hey, you look like Tony Hawk." And he turned to see him and said, "Haha, I read your tweets." Tony added, "Is this the beginning or the end? Hashtag tweetception." I have 2 thoughts on this. 1, this just demonstrates how important these series of tweets are if people are referencing them to Tony Hawk in public. And 2, I think it's very interesting how adding "ception" onto the end of something makes it mean like a thing inside of a thing. Because obviously it's referencing the fact that in the film Inception, they go inside of a dream, inside of a dream, inside of a dream. But the word Inception in the context of the movie Inception has nothing to do with the dream inside of a dream inside of a dream. The word Inception in the movie basically means what it always means, which is like the beginning of an idea. They are using Inception to Cillian Murphy's character to make him think of an idea. The dream inside of a dream inside of a dream thing is a completely separate plot mechanic. So technically speaking, tweetception should really mean the concept of coming up with a tweet. Of course, I'm not actually mad about this, and this has nothing to do with this tweet, but it is something I've thought about a lot and have never had a place to say it out loud, and this is my series and I can say whatever I want. A great moment is that in 2023, when Kareem Abdul-Jabbar recognized Tony Hawk at an airport and took a photo with him, multiple people, including Bones through Daybreak 2 The Return, said, finally, someone actually recognized Tony Hawk at the airport. And people have made jokes about this whole phenomenon. Cat enthusiast ACAP tweeted, Tony Hawk walks up to a TSA agent before boarding his flight. He says to the agent, I've been really depressed lately and I'm not sure what to do about it. The agent replies, I have just the thing. Tony Hawk, the famous skateboard champion, is in town. You should go see him. This is referencing the famous joke where a guy goes to a doctor and the doctor says, you should see the famous clown Pagliacci is in town, and the guy says, of course, I am Pagliacci. The joke being that the TSA agent doesn't recognize Tony Hawk in the same way that the doctor doesn't recognize the clown Pagliacci. I don't know why referencing the but I am Pagliacci joke is so common on joke Twitter, but it just is. I think that these tweets from Tony Hawk are so popular because they are relatable. Not that we all can relate to being recognized or almost recognized in public, but because I think we all think that this is what it would be like for us if we were famous. And that he seems to take all of this in stride and think it's funny. Whereas it feels like a lot of celebrities either really don't want to be recognized at all and don't like it when they're recognized, or will be offended by someone not necessarily knowing who they are. He seems to have a very healthy attitude towards his fame. And I think that that's why people like him a lot. And that goodwill is why there's also a famous tweet from him where he says, I appreciate the hesitation. Don't worry, I'll get to it. Follow me for a new tweet every day and consider subscribing on Patreon, patreon.com/Museum of Twitter, where you can do things like vote on what I cover on Subscriber Sundays. And you also get the weekly Museum of Not Twitter, a video series where I talk about a thing that was big on the internet that did not start on Twitter.